Hello, my name is Owen, and welcome to my top books in 2024. This, ladies and gentlemen, my favorites, the best of the best, my top 10 list of books that I read in 2024. We're going to take a stroll down memory lane, see what the old O-Meister was up to in the last 12 months or so. For those of you that missed my recap video, I read a total of 42 books last year, so I know what you may be thinking. So almost 25% of the books that I read last year will be on this list. Yes, that's what I'm saying. It's exactly what I'm saying. Because there's a lot of studs on this list. There's a lot of duds as well that we read in 2024, but we're not talking about those today. We're not making that video. We're not a hater like that. Because most of the time, I don't think I could give you a top 5 or bottom 5 books that I've read, like top 5 worst books I've read, because honestly, I got pretty good tastes. I got pretty good instincts for these kind of things. A lot of them, if I didn't like a book, it's more just like it made me feel nothing. But we're not talking about the bottom. We're talking about the top 10, okay? And how I structured this list, I read a couple series this year, but there's only one book. Really, there's only one book per author on this list. I have 10 unique authors, and I got some honorable mentions as well. So we actually got 12 unique authors on this list. And I felt like I had a great reading year, had a lot of variety in genre, definitely a lot of variety in authors, a lot of authors that I'd never read before, as well as some familiar favorites coming back into the play. Very satisfying reading year for me. Definitely. 42 books, not the most books you've ever heard somebody read an entire year, but I think it's a very solid list, and I'm very, very happy with how my top 10 turned out. Because if you remember last year, I could only do a top 5 for 2023 because that's how many stinkers I read in 2023. So the fact that I have 10 and honorable mentions just shows how excited I am about these books that I read and how I want to share them with you. So you should be thanking me. You're welcome, audience. You're welcome so much. So let's just start. Let's just get right into it. Number 10. My number 10 book of the year was The Wager by David Grann. This is the only nonfiction book that makes the list. And to David Grann's credit, it was a great nonfiction book. So much so that in my review of that book, I declared that I was going to instantly read all of his other books. Didn't do that, but would still like to potentially someday. So this follows the shipwreck and the mutiny, the survival of the crew of the Wager, and it's set during times of like the high seas, right, where sailors were sailing around. There's war, there's threats of pirates. It's Pirates of the Caribbean made real, right? And it was a fantastic true story of this ship, the Wager, and the characters that were a part of this crew and the story that unfolds. David Grann, and I say this a lot about nonfiction, it takes a lot of skill to write nonfiction in a way that feels like fiction, to keep you engaged in the real life story that occurred. David Grann has a great strength at making nonfiction story read like it's an epic fantasy fiction adventure, even though it's true. He has a great balance of giving you the adventure while giving you the facts. And while I didn't fact check him personally, it felt like he knew what he was talking about, okay? He quoted his sources properly, according to proper citations that I learned in high school. But it was very well-rounded, a good balance of the knowledge versus the adventure of it. And for a nonfiction read, which are always just a little bit slower, it was a very easy, fun, engaging read for me, which for nonfictions, it's hard to come by, to be honest. I've read a lot of like classified great nonfictions that are just too dry for me. I read like a World War I book a couple of years ago, and it's one of my worst reviewed reviews on the channel because I got all like the history nerds coming up at my grill saying, "You're actually an imbecile. This is the greatest World War I book of all time." And I just said, it was boring, okay? And that's a valid criticism, brother. All of the facts could have been in there very eloquently, and it's very insightful. But if I'm bored, I hit the dislike button, okay? Call me uncultured, call me Gen Z, but that's just the way I roll, brother. That is our number 10. Moving up to number 9, we got a bit of recency bias, ladies and gentlemen. It is The Three Musketeers by Alexander Dumas. I literally finished this on December 31st, got it in right at the wire at the end as the clock expired. We finished the book. so it counts. And you know what? I had a lot of fun with it. This is the only book that I'll talk about today that I don't currently have a review up on the channel because it is not made yet, okay? But it will be coming out shortly. I had an interesting journey with the Three Musketeers. The Count of Monte Cristo was my book of the year in 2022. It was my favorite book of that year that I read, and I was really excited to get the Three Musketeers. It's going to be a very long time to get to it. But as we said, we just finished it at the end of the year, just a couple days ago. And I went in with high expectations. I thought it started very, very strong. There's a lot of things I liked about that book, but it did lose me in parts, which is why it's not higher on the list. That being said, some of the characters I think are some of the best done characters, some of the best done friendships, some of the best done villains I've ever read in fiction. Okay, that's a bold statement. And I thought the ending was so satisfying, so engaging, and so entertaining that it brings it into my top 10. But really, like some of the middle parts, it just didn't grip me the way that I wanted to be gripped, quite frankly. And it wouldn't have made the top 10 list at all, or even an honorable mention, had not the ending been so strong. And keep an eye out for that review, because that'll be an interesting, nuanced review, because there's a lot of specific things I want to talk about with that book. But because of the ending, because of the character work, it brings it up to the number 9 spot of the year. Moving on to number 8, we have Beach Read by Emily Henry. Emily Henry is a very, very popular romance author, one that I delved into for the first time at the beginning of this year. I think I read 3 of her books in like the first 6 months of the year. Of the 3 that I read, Beach Read was by far my favorite. I do like to peruse a good romance every once in a while. I'm not just fantasy Bill over here, but the one thing that's important with a romance is you have to balance the romance, obviously, with like the good premise, like the hijinks that would ensue, and then there's always the third element where it's like the main character or maybe the love interest has like other relationship drama that they need to figure out either with their family or with other friends or sometimes just with themselves because they're just dark and twisted. Beach Read I thought was the perfect blend of all 3 of those things in an Emily Henry book at least, and I just found it very enjoyable. She's a very approachable writing style, very easy to read, and she's a solid writer. Sometimes you'll read romance where it's cheesy, it kind of makes you cringe because like you just like picture the person writing it as you're reading it, but I think Emily Henry is a fantastic writer, and even when I don't like her books, like in Funny Story, I didn't really enjoy that one, didn't really buy the romance, it's still solid writing. So that coupled with the particular story and the romance and the characters in Beach Read, I just think it works really well. And here's the thing, I know she's coming out with another book in 2025. I'm tempted to read it again just on the strength of Beach Read alone. I think the other book, Happy Place, I thought was enjoyable as well as a solid book. Funny Story really just didn't click with me, but I just think with her writing style, if you haven't read her books, she's popular for a reason. And if you like romance, she's very approachable. If you want to get into romance, I'm telling you straight up, it's a very easy entry point to do. So, and maybe you can find out what everybody's talking about with romance, because it's a very solid book. And you know what? It makes my number 8 book of the year over Three Musketeers. Some literary friends, okay, might kill me for that. If you put a modern romance author over Alexander Dumas in the Three Musketeers. But listen, this is why it's my list and not your list. I will not be taking criticisms at this time. Moving up to number 7, we have Olive Kitteridge by Elizabeth Strout. This is another recency bias. This is another book that I read at the very beginning of December, or finished at the beginning of December, rather. And this book is right up my alley of literary fiction. If I'm asking you to describe, or if you're asking me to describe, why would I ask you to describe it? If you're asking me to describe what my perfect setup for a literary fiction book is, it's just slice of life, people doing their every little things, but the author has a deep grasp, has a firm grip. I keep saying grip and grasp today, but they have a good picture of what it means to be human and what the relatable everyday struggles of a human being is. Olive Kitteridge is perfect in that regard. I think Elizabeth Strout does a great job at not only just Olive, who's this very interesting character herself, but like doing these little vignettes of this small town in Maine. You really get that small town feel, but each one you empathize with these characters, and the ones that you don't empathize with, maybe that you disagree with, or they make mistakes, they're all relatable mistakes. They're all very human mistakes, and it's a very human feeling book. And it's a very specific vibe that I'm talking about here, but Elizabeth Strout captures it perfectly with this book. I think Olive Kitteridge is a fantastic character, a great through line through all these little vignette stories, and her own stories as well are some of the most powerful, some of the most like moving pieces about like growing old or love in an older age, I should say, and dealing with grief and stuff like that comes with aging through the town and kind of seeing her life progression in that way. It's just really fantastically done. And when I did my review of that, I compared it to like Frederick Bachman's work. If you've read any of his books, it's very, very similar to that to me. A little less witty, a little less funny than some of Bachman's work. Like Man Called Ove is kind of a little bit funny. Anxious People is kind of a little bit funny. It's more similar to like his Beartown work. Not as dark as Beartown perhaps, but in terms of like gritty human emotions. But overall, it's not super. It's not going to send you into deep, dark depression. It's just going to make you a little bit sad, okay, sometimes. But overall, it's an optimistic, hopeful feel to the book, which I always appreciate as well about these really human books is what I'm talking about. Moving on, and that's my number 7, Olive Kitteridge. Moving on to number 6, we have True Crime by Andrew Klavan. This was one of my book of the months early on in the year, and this is the first crime thriller. I don't know if it's the first I've ever read. It's the first I've read at least in a long time. I've never purposely delved into this genre, so I was kind of on the fence. I do like a quick, easy read, but it's not really a genre I delve into often. That being said, this is a beat the clock thriller. I remember what it said on the back of the book. It's really suspenseful. It keeps it moving. It's fast paced. It's got the time limit of a man on death row. He's got to solve the case and prove his innocence before time runs out. Beautifully written, beautifully complex, and at some points wholly dislikable protagonist who's trying to solve this crime. In the mixture of the crime itself, trying to uncover the mystery, or trying to set this man free based on the protagonist's own flaws, his own personal life, they clash perfectly into a great, really entertaining, really like adrenaline-raising crime thriller, and I thought it was extremely, extremely well done. So it made my number 6 spot of the year. Before we get into the top 5, let's talk about some honorable mentions, starting off with another crime thriller, When the Bow Breaks by Jonathan Kellerman. This is another book that I really stumbled upon this year. I was gifted it as a Christmas present last year. I got a first edition. When the Bow Breaks is the first Kellerman book of this character that he writes about a lot. So it's his first book, first edition of that. I'm like, oh, that's pretty cool. Never heard of this guy or this series that has like a dozen books, but I read it. Another great crime thriller. Didn't quite make it into my top 10, but I thought the interesting thing about this book is like the protagonist. He's not a detective. He's not a lawyer. He's not anything to do with crime. He's a child psychologist, and he kind of has this interesting angle. And the crime in this book is about children and involves children's psychology. So he's very apt to the job. I'd be interested to see how how the author handles that profession into other crimes, because it's all child-related crimes, or is it just like he walks into a crime scene one day and they're like, hey, you solved a crime once, help us again. I'm interested though, but the writing is very solid. I think the interesting premise of his profession, it's very clear the author did a lot of research into creating this character, and has like a background in this knowledge at least, because the character is very clearly a psychologist. And it's very interesting the way that he approaches the crimes, the way he solves them, and has a great, great entertaining climax as well. So that's my first honorable mention. The second honorable mention is Mercury by Amy Jo Burns. This was one of my I'm going to test Barnes & Noble books because it was their book of the month for January last year, and it was ridiculously overpriced. I'm like, you know what, Barnes & Noble, I believe you're full of crap. This book probably sucks. So as I do when I'm trying to prove a company wrong, I spend $40 at their store, and I buy a hardcover of an author and a book that I've never heard of in my entire life. But you know what? It was pretty good, and I did like it. And I want to give an honorable mention, not because it was one of my favorite books of the year, but because of how much it did surprise me. It's about a small town in western Pennsylvania, and it's about like this woman who kind of marries into this family who's got a lot of drama, they got a lot of baggage, she's kind of wading her way through it. I thought it was very, very well done. It's on my shelf back here. It's the light blue one right here. And you know what? I had a lot of fun with it. I grew up in Western Pennsylvania, so some of the references I got, it does get a little bit too flowery at times. I'm like, trust me, no one's talking like that in Western PA. It gets a little bit too literature at times, I would say, is my biggest criticism of it. But overall, I thought it was well done. I thought the drama was well done. I thought the character work was well done. It's not a story that will stick with you, I guess, for the longest time, but it was an enjoyable read, an enjoyable piece of literary fiction that really captures kind of the specific time period, but it's not like super long ago, but also like kind of like the setting itself. It was a unique read, and I wanted to give it a shout out. Now, moving into the top 5, we have A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara. This was a book I was very excited to read. I was told by a lot of people that it's a controversial book by a lot of people's opinion. They either love it or they hate it. And when I was talking to Jimmy Nuts, he said the same thing. He said that he loved it, but a lot of people hate it. And I heard that it was depressing as well. I will say a lot of those things are very indeed true. I did enjoy it. I wouldn't say it was my favorite book of all time. It's only my number 5 this year, but I did really, really enjoy it. And I encourage you to check out that review because it's a very complicated book to talk about. It is very dark. It is very depressing. You have to be ready. You have to be mentally prepared for that going into it. And it's a good thing that I did know that. I mean, the picture on the cover is a man who looks like he's having the worst time of his life. Looks like he's bawling his tears out. But evidently, that's not what the picture is, but that's what it looks like, right? It looks like it's a sad book. It's black and white. Looks very dramatic. It is very dramatic, and it is very depressing and dark. So I would say know that before going into it. That being said, as I said in my review of the book, it is undeniably a piece of art. The author clearly knew exactly what they wanted to say when writing this book, and it's all very intentional. It feels very intentional. Whether or not you agree with all the choices, that's why it's controversial, but it felt to me like a fully realized piece of art, and it's one of those books that will sit with you. When you're reading it, for better or for worse, you kind of get into the mood of this story, which is a little bit down, a little bit depressing, a little bit dark, and you really feel so deeply, so empathetically for these characters, which is a sign of fantastic writing, even though you may not agree with to the extremes that this author goes to really push that down upon you. I thought it was a very interesting piece of art, and I'm extremely glad that I read it. And overall, I did enjoy it personally. But like I said, it's one you got to approach with trepidation, I would say. But that's our number 5. Number 4 was my favorite Romance of the Year. Romance of the Year award, romance lovers. Listen here. This is a book that I guarantee none of you TikTok sons of guns have ever read in your entire life. It is Frenchmans Creek by Daphne du Maurier. A very popular book. A lot of people have read it, but I'm telling you, these modern audiences need to get onto that Daphne du Maurier grind, okay? This is my favorite romance book, possibly of all time, okay? It's got pirates. It's got swashbuckling. It's got the English countryside. Need I say more? To some people, probably like, yes, please say more. But for me, right up my alley. I thought it was a fantastic romance, fantastic drama, classic Daphne du Maurier character work where the protagonist has got their flaws and their flaws play directly into the plot, and it all comes in so nicely. The romance, and again, like I said with Emily Henry, a great balance of romance. It's plot and it's romance. For du Maurier, I'd say her romances take a little bit more of a back seat. Obviously, it's the heart and soul of the book, but really it's like this character work and her struggles that are take the forefront, and this romance just plays perfectly into the themes of her character, of her growth, and it all just plays off so well. One of my favorite reads of the year by one of my favorite authors of all time, Daphne du Maurier. Probably my second favorite book of hers of all time, behind My Cousin Rachel, which I will never stop talking about. It's a great thriller, but Frenchman's Creek is a great romance, and I encourage everybody to check it out. Moving into number 3, perhaps a surprise pick for the O-Meister. It is Pet Sematary by Stephen King. Now, The Stand is my favorite book of all time, so we know I'm a Stephen King fan. Or am I? Because I run into a lot of problems with Stephen King. The Dark Tower series, did not particularly enjoy overall. There were some high points. There were mostly low points for me. I know it's a controversial opinion. I did not finish 11/22/63. I did not. What else did I not do with Stephen King? I don't know. I just know that I got a lot more misses with Stephen King than I do hits, even though my hits are very strong. Pet Sematary is a slam dunk. I think it's the best horror book that I've ever read. I listened to it on audiobook, which normally I like books less. I've listened to an audiobook. I think I like this one more. It was Michael C. Hall, the Dexter guy who voiced my audiobook that I listened to. He did a fantastic job, but it really captures like the good mix of like supernatural, psychological horror, and this whole like the whole theme of death and dealing with grief and dealing with death played perfectly into like the characters' insecurities and even like your own insecurities as a reader of your own fears about death. And I just thought the conclusion, it was eerie, it was creepy, it all paid off perfectly for me in exactly the way that I wanted it to. And I'm not a big horror guy. I don't go out of my way to read a lot of horror books, but this is one that really stood out to me and that I really, really enjoyed. It's my number 3 book of the entire year, which is great news. Moving on to number 2, we have The Sword of the Lictor by Gene Wolfe. Now, this is the one I put the asterisk beside because it's really a stand-in for the entirety of Book of the New Sun, which is 4 books in one story, right? But I was recommended Book of the New Sun this year by you guys, and it was a very, very interesting experience for me. Sword of the Lictor, the reason I picked that one specifically, it was my favorite of the 4. It's the book where I finally started to get it. I think the second book in particular, I forget which one's the second book, but I'm like, I got no idea what's going on. It's getting confusing. I like the vibe of the first book. The second book, I was lost. Then when I got to Sword of the Lictor, it started clicking for me, and I understood why people are obsessed with it, why people go into deep dives about it, and it's where the story starts to explain itself a little bit, which I appreciated. And it's a very unique, very of its time fantasy book series, and it's such a unique tone, and it's one of those books that you really can't explain the plot to like a passerby on the street. In fact, I tried it when I was reading it, and I'm like, well, it's about this guy, and it's like the future, but it's like the past, and he goes and he travels around, he's a torturer, but no one likes him, and he finds a gem, and then they're like, what are you talking about? That's the series for me, and I still, sitting in front of you today, I cannot explain to you exactly why I liked it so much, why I thought it was good, but the reason why it's my number 2 of the list, because I've never experienced this quite so strongly before, even like when reading Malazan, which I'm currently rereading, I've never felt the urge so strongly to reread a group of 4 books. Because the way that the last book ends, it basically says like, you idiot, you gotta reread it. And I'm like, what? What do you mean? And he's right, I do need to reread it. So just the pull of that series, it's like it's just a cloud hanging above my head, which sounds negative, and maybe it is. Maybe I'm just Stockholm Syndrome into this now. But I feel like it's just like this strange, it's got such a strange vibe and a strange story, and it's like one of those books where it's like you're reading like a religious text where there's like so much deeper meaning, you're just too stupid to understand, but you like the feeling of being dumber than the book. This book is for you if you like that feeling, I guess. But I just so desperately want to reread it, but I'm giving myself time away from it before I jump back into it. It was just such a unique reading experience for me, and the fact that I stumbled upon it, well, I mean, obviously it was recommended to me, but I really had no preconceived notion about what the book was or what it was going to be about or what to expect from it. Going into it completely blind, just based on word alone, was a very unique reading experience for me, and I encourage fantasy lovers to check it out, because I think if you're predisposed to fantasy, it will definitely help with it. But it's got a weird flavor that I've never quite encountered in another book before. In the Book of the New Sun as a whole, but Sword of the Lictor in particular was my favorite. Now, moving on to number 1, the number 1 book of 2024. This is a very important distinction. It'll go down in the record books. Even though I don't remember what my favorite book was last year, this is important, okay? It's so important. My favorite book of 2024 was none other than, if you're a friend of the channel, you might know it. You might be able to guess at least. Because it's a book I talked about a lot, about how much I liked, and I haven't mentioned it yet. That's your clue. It is none other than Children of Dune by Frank Herbert. Now listen, this is not an asterisk. This is not a stand-in for Dune Messiah and Dune 1. Those books don't make the top 10. I enjoyed both of those books very heartily. They'd probably make the top 15. Children of Dune is my favorite Dune book of the 3 by a country mile, okay? And I know what you're thinking. You probably saw the TikToks. Oh, somebody turns into a worm. The Dune books go off the rails after the movies end. Not true. True, but not true, okay? Like I said in that review, and I encourage you to watch that review as well, Children of Dune is the book that Dune and Dune Messiah are preempting. They're simply the prologues to Children of Dune. I thought that book, more so than any of the first two, was complete thematically, was complete with the character work. It was all just build up to that. Before, like Dune in particular, it has its moments where it kind of like, it gets weird, it gets like vague, and you kind of lose the plot a little bit. Dune Messiah is kind of an interesting like character study, and it's shorter, and it's weird, and I can say it's weird, okay? But it is shorter. It's just a character study of Paul and kind of the aftermaths of Dune. But it leads directly into Children of Dune, which I feel like is a more straightforward storyline, easier to follow, but it really is on the foundation of those first two books and just builds on it magnificently. Like the themes of like the spirits of their ancestors, like in their minds, of being like an abomination when you're born, having the memories of all your ancestors in your head, and how that plays into the themes, and how it plays into like the kids grappling with their parents and who their parents are in this universe, and what they did in the past, and how, coupled with this power that they have, how they're grappling with that, how they can talk to their own ancestors, how that plays into the characters from the past books coming forward, and how it all concludes. It just felt so inevitable is the right word. Every decision that Frank Herbert heard, as weird as it sounds in a TikTok clip, makes perfect sense. And that's why I think, like, honestly, those TikToks probably the worst thing that ever happened to the Dune series, because you watch the Timothée Chalamet movie and you go, oh, it's simple. He likes Zendaya and he leads the Sand People. What? The books get weird? There's people turning into worms? That's weird. Never going to do that. It's true that does happen, okay? I'm not going to say it doesn't happen, but it happens for great reason. And it happens for reasons that are built upon the first movie and are more cinematic. And if they ever make that movie, it'll be the greatest movie of all time, okay? I would not bet my life on that, but if they made it good, it would be great, okay? It's just a book, like, I could reread Children of Dune right now, where it's like, I read Dune Messiah. I would reread Children of Dune right now. I just thought it was so well done, and maybe if I reread it, I would think it was worse, but at the time, it's just sitting in the forefront of my mind, okay? I thought Children of Dune was a fantastic sci-fi book. I thought the way that and just as a sci-fi book, let's take it outside of the Dune universe. The way it uses like its futuristic technology, it mixes like kind of like a magic system, and used it in a unique way that not only like was interesting in like as a plot device, but also like played into the themes of the characters, the struggles of the characters. It's just overall a great piece of fiction. And it's similar to how like the Force in Star Wars is such a cool, like mysterious, and it like plays into like the power, the will of the characters. The magic systems in Dune do the exact same thing. I think like sometimes even better thematically, because like they're a little bit more detailed and a little bit more weird, a little bit more niche. But I just thought it was all extremely well done. And the conversation between Leto 2 and the preacher, some of the best conversations in all of fiction. And it just makes me so excited just thinking about it. And I know I'm just rambling on. I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm not a Dune head, but it was my favorite book of the year. And it'll go down in history as that. And eventually, when I remember the 2023, it'll join that rank along with Counting Monte Cristo, and we'll all live happily ever after. But that's my top 10 of the list. Overall, a fantastic one. And I feel like we got a good array of genres on there. We snuck one nonfiction in at the very bottom of the list. But we got some romance, we got some fantasy, we got some sci-fi, we got some horror, we got some crime thriller in there. And they all just tickled my fancy. And you know what? It was a great year overall. What I want to know, obviously, the big question is, what was your favorite book of 2024? Put it below in the comments. If I didn't read it, if I haven't read it in the past, maybe I'll read it in 2025. Maybe I'll bring back Book of the Month for 2025. I was on a good streak. I did like 4 or 5, I think, and then I stopped forever. But maybe I'll bring it back by reading everyone's favorite books of the year, because there are a couple good books that are going to be coming out new in 2025. But, you know, I'm always looking for good recommendations, even if I don't make it like a Book of the Month. I'm always synthesizing that kind of stuff, guys. And I want to know, what was your top book, your favorite book of the entire year? Comment it down below. I really appreciate it, guys. And be sure to like and subscribe if you liked the video and you want to see more like in the future. And as always, thank you for sticking around.